It was due to be taped. I called up Dion. I said, you know what? I can't do Soul Train, the second one. I can't do this. I can't do.
The show was due to be taped. I called up Dion. I said, you know what I can't do? Soul Train, the second one. I can't do this. I can't do it. David Bowie started. He did flat out. You give it out to my dad? Yeah, absolutely. I had never been out of New York City before Bowie took me on the road with him. And I was still living with my mother when he took me on the road with him. Really, yeah. Luther Vandross wasn't just a soul music legend. He was also a man who carried too many secrets, too many wounds, in a world that never allowed black artists to live openly with their true identity. In the final years of his life, he rewrote a list naming 6 gay men who had betrayed him in the cruelest ways. They were friends, lovers, proteges, but when he needed them, they denied, dodged, and erased every trace of connection. That list was never made public until this video. One Germaine Stewart. When love became a humiliating joke among the men who stepped into Luther Vandross's life and walked out with lies, Germaine wasn't the cruelest, but he was the first to strike with a venomous, unforgettable blow. Germaine Stewart was once seen as a curious phenomenon amid the flashy pop wave of black music in the 1980s. He hit the stage with curled hair, shimmering sequin jackets, and a voice as sweet as sugar, but laced with flamboyance. His song, We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off, released in March 1986, turned him into a symbol of youth and innocence. But ironically, that clean image was just a thin layer of gloss, masking a behind-the-scenes life full of contradictions, rumors, and dirty games no one expected. Luther Vandross once said in a voice barely audible, "Not all wounds bleed. Some things simmer for a lifetime." And maybe he was thinking about the night in Detroit, June 14th, 1987. A night that should have been nothing more than a fleeting memory, but instead became a nightmare that haunted him for over a decade. They met during a joint performance at the Fox Theater in Detroit, part of the Night of Soul tour, sponsored by Jet magazine. At that time, Luther was at the peak of his fame with the album Give Me the Reason, while Germaine was already struggling after his second single flopped. It was a sweltering night. The stage lit up brilliantly, and somewhere between the songs, their eyes met. No one noticed. No one suspected. Only Luther's gaze softened slightly, and Germaine gave a strange smile, half shy, half calculated. After the backstage party at the Anium Suite Hotel around 1 a.m., on June 15th, Luther and Germaine left the main lobby together. A security guard later confirmed they went up to the 19th floor. The door closed at 1:17 a.m., according to the security cameras. And that night, as Luther later shared with close friend and producer Marcus Miller, was a gentle night, simple, with no expectations, no strings, just 2 lonely souls finding each other. But only 48 hours later, everything began to fall apart. On June 17th, in the dressing room at the Orpheum Theater in Minneapolis, Germaine started whispering to the dancers and crew. Luther likes scented candles more than I like champagne, and he made me shower first because he couldn't stand the smell of hair dye. Everyone laughed. At first, it was just a joke or two. But the more Germaine spoke, the deeper and nastier it got. He mimicked Luther's voice, mockingly bashful. "Oh no, don't turn off the lights. I'm scared of the dark and the truth." The rumors spread fast. On the June 19th flight to Chicago, one of the backup singers overheard a dancer whispering, "We don't have to take our clothes off." But girl, he did. Then came the cheap giggles echoing through the first-class cabin. Luther sat 3 rows away, headphones on, pretending to sleep. The final blow came during Germaine's live radio interview on WGCI-FM in Chicago on the morning of June 20th, 1987. When asked about recent romantic rumors, he didn't hesitate to drop a cold line. Some people can sing with all their heart, but can't live honestly with it. The host burst out laughing. No one asked who, but everyone knew exactly who he meant. That evening, during the Airy Crown Theater concert, part of the same tour, Luther sang only 3 songs before leaving early. A lighting technician later recalled he cried alone in the dressing room, a towel over his head, mumbling, "Shouldn't have trusted. Shouldn't have opened that door." Germaine never apologized. But his life wasn't spared its own storms. In 1988, after a few failed studio attempts, Germaine sank into endless gay club nights in Los Angeles at places like Studio One and Probe. He showed up in see-through outfits, eyes glazed from drugs, still trying to brag about bedroom stories with R&B legends as a last-ditch effort to be remembered. But no one laughed anymore. By then, people were whispering something scarier. Germaine was looking thinner, his skin a sickly gray, always carrying a handkerchief to wipe nosebleeds. In February 1990, during a short gig at a small club in San Francisco, Germaine collapsed in the middle of the first song. The press claimed he was overworked, but witnesses said plainly, he came on stage in a wreck, trembling dark circles under his eyes, his face breaking out in strange rashes. In 1994, Germaine fell seriously ill with HIV. He tried to return to the stage with a demo recording in a small studio in Venice, California. But no one cared anymore. He died quietly on March 17, 1997, in Homewood, Illinois. No public funeral, no stars showed up, and Luther, the man who once held him in the dark that June night, didn't send flowers either. To Luther Vandross, the Detroit night of 1987 wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a humiliation when another man turned sincere affection into a public punchline. To Johnny Gill, erasing all gratitude with just one sentence. If Germaine Stewart was the one who kicked off the pain with mockery, then the next man hurt Luther in the most cold-blooded way. Johnny Gill was once considered the most alluring baritone voice in the late 1980s R&B world. He rose from New Edition, then conquered fans with a booming solo career, especially with the sensual love song My Myons of Swoon. With his masculine looks, deep voice, and commanding presence, Johnny became the epitome of a real man in black music. But what the public didn't see was that after the stage lights dimmed, Johnny once spent a secret year under the shadow of the one man he never dared to acknowledge, Luther Vandross. The story began quietly in early 1986. Johnny had just split from a duet act with Stacey Lattisaw and was drifting in his 20s with a blurry career ahead. During a small audition at Atlantic Studios in New York, he sang an unfinished ballad. That voice reached Luther's ears. He was recording in the studio next door. Luther walked in without pleasantries. He looked Johnny in the eye and said one thing. "Your voice doesn't need to scream. It needs to be held like a secret." From then on, they started appearing together quietly, cautiously, without fanfare. Johnny often dropped by the studio late, watching Luther through the two-way glass. Some nights, they dined in Luther's Harlem apartment. Luther cooking pasta, Johnny picking the background music. No one called it love, but both knew if there was any place Johnny could be himself, it was when he laid his head on Luther's shoulder and called him Lou, in a whisper barely louder than breath. They kept it hidden for almost a year. No photos, no public parties. But Luther's crew all noticed Johnny becoming a familiar presence. A student learning how to breathe, how to glide between notes. Someone Luther protected, guided, and loved with a gentleness he gave no other male artist. Then suddenly, Johnny went strangely silent. In January 1988, he returned to New Edition to replace Bobby Brown. Luther still supported him, quietly watching. But by mid-1990, when Johnny released his self-titled solo album and became a media darling, Luther's messages went unanswered. A demo called "Don't Leave Me Unspoken," written especially for Johnny Aching and Delicate, was returned. Everything broke in September that year. In a televised interview, when asked about Luther's influence, Johnny just shrugged and said coldly, "He was just a fan, someone who admired me, nothing more." That sentence was a blade. Luther heard it. He got up from the studio and never mentioned Johnny again. Johnny kept rising, kept embodying the blackmail ideal. He was frequently seen with Eddie Murphy. That too was a suspicious relationship clouded in rumors. But he denied it all. Denied Luther, denied Eddie, denied his true self. To Luther Vandross, Johnny wasn't just a secret lover. He was the unspoken wound. A man loved to the fullest, who chose to turn his back to be hailed as a real man. One quiet year of love, one ice-cold rejection, and a silence that lasted to the end of Luther's life. It wasn't just a breakup. It was an escape. And the one who ran was the one who had been loved the most. 3. Teddy Pendergrass, the man who mocked love, then spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Some wounds don't leave scars, but they stay with you forever, buried in the memory of a man who once loved in silence. For Luther Vandross, the memory named Teddy Pendergrass wasn't a romance. It was the greatest shame he ever carried, not because he loved the wrong man, but because that man turned his back, ridiculed him, and destroyed everything fragile between them, with just one sentence. In the late 1970s, when Luther was still an uncredited background singer, Teddy Pendergrass was already a star. A hulking figure shirt unbuttoned to his navel, a thick, sensual voice that sent thousands of women tossing lingerie onto the stage. But what the public didn't know was that behind that image, Teddy had very few friends. Very few people in the black music scene were truly close to him, except Luther. They first met backstage at a Philadelphia International Records event in 1977, where Luther had been hired to record background vocals for a test version of "Close the Door." A technician recalled that after hearing Luther sing a few harmonies, Teddy walked over, shook his hand, held it for a long time, and said, "You sing like you've made love to every word." Luther laughed. It was the first time he'd blushed from a compliment. After that, they ran into each other occasionally. Not often, but enough to get noticed. One time in Houston, Luther stood backstage watching Teddy's entire performance, eyes locked. Another night in New Orleans, Teddy invited Luther to dinner. Just the two of them. No manager, no security. No one knows what happened during that meal, but when they returned to the hotel, they stepped out of the same car, and no one saw Luther in his room until the next morning. The rumors exploded in October 1979 after a concert at Airy Crown Theater in Chicago. A lighting technician claimed he saw them riding the hotel elevator together around 2:00 a.m., whispering and laughing, shoulders brushing. Luther wore a gray silk robe. Teddy still had on his white stage suit. It wasn't until 9:00 a.m. that either of them was seen again on opposite sides of the hallway. No one asked. The glances said it all. People in the industry started speculating. A small NY Entertainment Weekly column in May 1980 hinted that two famous R&B stars were spotted leaving a hotel room after a long night. No names, but no one doubted it was Luther and Teddy. The press began to dig. Then during a press conference in Manhattan in June 1980, someone dared to ask outright, "Do you have any relationship with Luther Vandross? There are rumors you two spent the night together." The room went dead silent. Teddy didn't blush. He didn't dodge. He burst into laughter, a cold, cutting laugh. Then he said loud and clear, "I'm a real man. I don't sing for no gay stuff." Luther wasn't there, but a close friend said he cried when he heard those words, not because he was outed, but because someone he trusted, someone who once whispered to him in the dark, now treated him like something to be ashamed of. The next day, Luther cut all ties with Teddy. No calls, no letters, no name ever spoken again. Not once. And then just 3 months later, fate turned the page like a slap to the face. On the night of March 18th, 1982, Teddy Pendergrass was in a horrific car crash in Philadelphia. He was driving a silver-blue Rolls-Royce down Lincoln Drive when he lost control and slammed into a guardrail. His passenger, according to police reports, was Tenka Watson, a transgender woman. The entire city shook. Teddy survived, but was paralyzed from the neck down. From soul music's ultimate sex symbol to a man in a wheelchair, relearning how to breathe, how to eat, how to speak. And like a bitter whisper, some called it karma. Not because he was with a transgender woman, but because not even 100 days earlier, he had just denied the existence of a man who once loved him for real. For the rest of his life, Teddy lived in isolation. He still sang half of himself, still released albums through memory. But the voice that once dripped with seduction now carried bitterness. He rarely spoke of the past, never answered questions about the 70s, and absolutely never said Luther's name. Luther never reached out, not once, not in the studio, not at charity events, not at the hospital when Teddy was hospitalized, not in the final years. A mutual friend recalled that in 1995, when Teddy released the album A Little More Magic, Luther just gave a sad smile and shook his head. That's the last thing I ever wanted, to give him a little more magic. But I guess he threw that away a long time ago. Teddy Pendergrass died on January 13th, 2010. His funeral was a large affair covered by the media, with many artists in attendance. But Luther had already passed away 5 years earlier. And no one ever brought up the story buried between two of the most famous black men of the '80s. One who loved in silence, the other who once held his hand, then threw it into a pit of disgrace. In Luther's eyes, Teddy was the imagined lover. But in the eyes of history, Teddy will always be the man who lost the tenderness of a quiet love, only to spend the rest of his life sitting in solitude that no one could free him from. For Sylvester turned his back on the one who carried his debt. Before his death, Sylvester was called the Queen of Disco. But to Luther Vandross, he became nothing more than a treacherous man who trampled the tenderness of the only person who ever reached out when every door had slammed shut. Between Luther Vandross, who hid his heart behind his voice, and Sylvester, who wore his identity like an unbuttoned shirt, there once existed a quiet relationship flickering like a disco light at the end of the night. They had been together during rare performances, touched hands backstage, stepped into the same car at dawn, shared unreleased songs, and once slept side by side in a hotel room overlooking Castro Street. Neither ever confirmed it, but everything that happened afterward made denial pointless. In the 70s, Sylvester was the unchained fire of disco. Luther was the sigh of soul and R&B. One shouted, "I am me," in a sea of prejudice. The other bowed his head and sang of love in the dark. And strangely enough, that contrast was what brought them those brief unnamed nights, not called love, but never unloved. But it all disappeared after a few cold run-ins in the early '80s. Sylvester spiraled into bankruptcy. Labels dropped him. The IRS came knocking. Shows were canceled, money gone, and his fame twisted by the very image he once proudly owned. No one in black music wanted to touch him anymore. Too gay, too much, too reckless. And in his most desperate moment, he called Luther, It was early 1985. Luther was preparing a new solo project. Epic Records allowed him to invite a guest artist for his fourth track as a thank you for financial success. Everyone at the label hoped he'd pick a safe name, Freddie Jackson, Patty Austin, or the newly rising Whitney Houston. But Luther chose Sylvester without hesitation. Even though they had cut off contact for years, Luther extended his hand to bring Sylvester back into the studio. He didn't choose him for music alone. He wanted to give him a chance to rebuild, start over, and maybe find forgiveness through the one thing they both understood best: music. Luther covered all costs up front, renting a private studio in Los Angeles, paying the band in advance, and even secretly covering $12,000 in back taxes for Sylvester through a third party. No invoices, no contracts, no strings attached. What Luther didn't expect was that right inside the studio, the man he had rescued would demand even more. Sylvester didn't want to be just a guest vocalist. He wanted co-producer credit, 50% of publishing rights. His face on the album cover. When the label rejected that, he snapped. He screamed, insulted the manager, then stared Luther straight in the face in front of the entire room and threw out a threat that left everyone frozen. If he didn't get more, he'd go public with everything. The hotel nights, the hidden demos, the handwritten notes Luther once slipped under his door. Luther didn't reply. He stood up, walked out, and never came back. The project was shelved. The song Grace, a love ballad Luther wrote specifically for Sylvester, was erased from the system. Over $80,000 in production costs went up in smoke. But the real pain wasn't financial. It was the knife in the back from the only man who had ever seen Luther at his most vulnerable. 2 weeks later, Sylvester leaked the unfinished demo into San Francisco's underground scene. A bootleg remix emerged, splicing Luther's voice with mocking laughter and chopped-up lines meant to sound like a cruel joke. The mix spread across gay clubs, becoming an inside story passed around by DJs like a trophy. Luther's secret man had exposed him on the dance floor. When Luther found out, he said nothing publicly. But insiders said he shattered a mirror in the studio, cut off all ties with anyone involved in that session, and refused to do any projects connected to the San Francisco scene from then on. All Bay Area shows were quietly canceled. Sylvester was buried from memory, as if he had never existed. By 1987, Sylvester was diagnosed HIV positive. He grew weaker. No one hired him. No label would reissue his work. He lived on public assistance in a small, damp apartment with no air conditioning. Before he died, he reportedly told a friend, "There was once someone willing to pay my debts just so I could hold a mic again, and I betrayed him." Whether that quote was real or just imagined regret, no one knows. Sylvester died on December 16, 1988. His funeral was held in San Francisco. Drag queens lined the street. Disco music filled the church. But Luther did not attend. He sent no flowers. He said nothing. Never spoke his name again. To Luther Vandross, Sylvester wasn't just a traitor. He was the most expensive lesson about the price of kindness. Because some people will take your hand to stand up only to use that same hand to drag you down when your back is turned. And some debts, even if paid in full, will be sold again just to buy a few more seconds of fame. 5. Frankie Knuckles, the man who betrayed with a record button. Frankie Knuckles wasn't like anyone else who passed through Luther Vandross's life. He wasn't an official lover, not a singer, not a rival on stage, but he was the only one Luther ever trusted enough to be completely bare body and soul inside a locked room. And that's what created the one wound Luther never forgave. They met through a mutual friend in the remixing industry. It was late 1984. Luther was at his peak, and Frankie, though already a top DJ in Chicago's gay club scene, was still an outsider in the mainstream music world. But he knew how to get close quietly, slowly. He sent Luther a remix of "A House Is Not a Home." No permission, no name, just a note. If you listen to this at midnight, I believe you'll understand. Luther did listen, and 2 weeks later they met for the first time in New York at a private R&B party. Frankie wore a gray turtleneck, sly eyes, but a soft voice that caught Luther off guard before he could raise his usual walls. They talked for 3 hours, then left together unnoticed. Their connection began with secret cassette messages, late-night walks through unlit parks, quiet studio sessions behind closed doors. No one spoke it out loud, but everyone saw that Luther, the man who lived in hiding, afraid of being caught, was letting Frankie into his private world. And one January night in 1985, when Luther performed a secret show in Chicago, they stayed at the same hotel. Frankie took him to the power plant after the show, and they spent the night together. No assistants, no witnesses, just red wine stains on glass, and a raw recording of "If This World Were Mine," sung a cappella by Luther in that room. No mic. Luther thought it was intimacy. Frankie saw it as raw material. The betrayal came just weeks later, when Luther returned to Chicago and dropped by the power plant again. He wore a hoodie, dark glasses came in through the back, the routine of a man who lived in the shadows. But this time, Frankie invited him into the private DJ booth. Luther trusted him, believed he was with someone who once touched him tenderly in the dark. No one knew that while Luther was opening up about fear about men in his past, about never being able to love freely, Frankie had already set up a recorder beneath the soundboard, not for blackmail, just for what he called honest art. He captured every confession, every fragile word, every cracked sentence, and later sampled them into a remixed track. Days later, the recording played at an underground party at the warehouse. Just a few lines. "I've never really been myself. If people knew who I am, I'd lose everything." Then came a slow house drop, followed by a sped-up hook. The club laughed. They recognized the voice. No name needed. The heartbreak was unmistakable. When Luther heard, he didn't scream, didn't call, didn't go public. But that same night, after receiving the tape from a close friend, he quietly burned every mix connected to Frankie. Burned the raw recording of "If This World Were Mine," burned the handwritten note Frankie had left after their night together. It said only, "Thanks for not locking the door." After that night, Luther canceled all Chicago shows for 3 straight years. Refused all offers from DJs or producers linked to Frankie. No explanations, no reasons. But everyone knew Luther had lost his last bit of faith that a man in the LGBT world could ever protect another's secret. Frankie didn't stop. He told the story indirectly in workshops as a parable about a famous singer who lived a lie. He never named Luther. But every time he played that sample, the crowd danced, screamed, laughed. And if someone ever mentioned Frankie's name in the studio, Luther would just nod and say, "Turn it off." To Luther, Frankie didn't just betray him. He stole the most fragile thing. A feeling that had no name turned into a looped beat played in the dark. What Luther thought was intimacy turned out to be prep for a reveal performance. And the hug that made him feel safe was the same arm that pressed record when he was most vulnerable. Frankie never apologized, but Luther never forgot. 6. Eddie Murphy, the powerful lover who denied everything. Among the men who passed through Luther Vandross's life, Eddie Murphy was the one who shattered everything. The fastest and the coldest. The first time they were seen together publicly was backstage at the Soul Train Awards on March 29, 1987 in Los Angeles. At the time, Eddie had just released his hit comedy special, Raw, and Luther was basking in the success of his album, Give Me the Reason, nominated for several categories. They didn't perform together, but their quiet connection behind the scenes caught the attention of many in the black entertainment industry. Both were private men, but they were often spotted at small events, private birthday parties, or late-night studio sessions, places where the press didn't shine their lights. From late 1989 to mid-1993, whispers began circulating among New York's soul music circles about strange cassettes Luther carried on tour. Not demos, but personal voice recordings from an unnamed man. No one confirmed it, but everyone understood. Everything came crashing down in the early hours of May 1997 when Los Angeles police pulled over Eddie Murphy on Santa Monica Boulevard. In the car with him was Addison Kenneth Cooley, a transgender woman previously under police watch for sex work. Though Eddie wasn't arrested, the incident exploded across the American media. He denied all allegations, but the pressure from the press film studio's conservative audiences and major sponsors forced him to act fast to save his image. Within 72 hours of the news breaking, Eddie's legal team was reportedly compiling a list of media risk individuals, people with whom he'd had personal relations, who might trigger a tabloid scandal. According to a source from the Beverly Hills music management scene, the internal document listed Luther Vandross as high risk if exposed by tabloids. On May 5, 1997, a team of legal representatives delivered an NDA directly to Luther's home, demanding that he legally agree never to reveal any details about his personal connection with Eddie Murphy, whether through words, actions, or even suggestive artistic work. For Luther, it was a direct strike one he didn't see coming. He never responded publicly, but just 10 days later, his previously announced summer tour dates under Warner Brothers were canceled without explanation. Several insiders confirmed he refused to go on stage after receiving the legal documents from Eddie's team. Meanwhile, Eddie began reshaping his public persona. By September 1997, he appeared on the NBC special Man Enough, a carefully staged program about celebrity pressure, which conveniently avoided any mention of the May incident. His career went on, even soared again, as he voiced Donkey in Shrek 2001 and received an Oscar nomination for Dreamgirls 2006. Luther, in contrast, began to quietly fade. From 1998 to 2001, he appeared only in small private shows, refused press interviews, and released no new major projects. Except for Dance with My Father in 2003, his final fully promoted album. When Luther suffered his first stroke on April 1, 2003, many colleagues in the music world visited or sent well wishes. Eddie was not among them. He didn't show up. He didn't send a message. He made no public statement after Luther's death. Not everyone knew the hidden thread that once tied them together, but those who had seen it from the beginning knew exactly what had happened. Eddie Murphy wasn't just a man with immense media pull. He was the one who had erased an entire chapter of his life that he had willingly stepped into, left a mark and then wiped clean out of fear it would drag him down. To Luther, it was a wound that never got bandaged. It silently spread, eating away at his trust, his pride, and his ability to stand tall under the stage lights like he once did. What he was forced to stay silent about in May 1997, according to many close to him, was the very beginning of a decline that could never be reversed in health, reputation, and spirit. We've just named 5 men, the 5 deepest wounds in Luther Vandross's life. A trail of betrayals wrapped in silence, ridicule, and calculation. They were once people he trusted completely, and one by one they turned their backs, as if they had never known him. Who do you think was the worst of them all? Is there someone else who belongs on this list? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartbreaking truths to